tending his sheep in the fields. That's exactly what David was. Artillery firing on a big, stationary target. Bears would have been more challenging. And when they brought him in front of Saul, David admired him. He looked like a king, big, brave, and handsome. And it seemed that Saul liked him too. He was like a father to David. His son Jonathan was like a brother to him. But to this day, David can't figure out what went wrong, what he'd done, what had happened that made Saul hate him so much and so suddenly. It was like one day he was playing and singing for Saul, marrying Michal, becoming a part of the family, and then the next Jonathan was helping him escape and he was running for his life. How quickly life moves, how suddenly things can change. 1 minute, everything in the world is going your way, and then suddenly, in an instant, it can be torn from your grasp and happiness can turn to ash in your mouth. They're all gone now as he sits on his throne. The prophet, Saul and Jonathan. And this all costs too much, David thinks. So much blood has been shed just to get this far. Do the ends justify the means? Was it all worth it? Is the price too heavy to pay? Is this really what God wants? Where do we go from here? Can there finally be peace at last? God seems to be blessing David, but why? And hadn't God blessed Saul too? And now Saul's dead. Where is God's blessing on him now? What had Saul done to lose it? And the new king sighs, and he wonders how not to end up like the previous king. Twice, David had kept him alive. Twice, David could have just as easily plunged a sword into Saul instead of walking away. Twice, Saul saw exactly what had happened, how easily David could have taken him, how David had spared his life because he still believed in Saul and that Saul was God's anointed. And Saul then promised to put an end to this feud, to stop chasing him, to let him just live his life. Saul knew that David was the better man. David hadn't wanted any of this. He never asked for any of this. He loved Saul. But the old man just wouldn't let it go. It was like he was possessed and he'd come to his senses occasionally, but then in the next moment he would completely forget about it. It was like all this power that Saul had led to hubris, and any praise of David, any love for David, Saul took as an attack against himself. They both couldn't be loved by the people. It was a binary situation with Saul. It was an either-or situation. And it got to the point where the credit couldn't even go to God. The credit all had to go to Saul, the power. Did it corrupt him, David wonders? Didn't the power of a king come from God? This is exactly what Samuel had tried to warn everyone about. The king can't be above God. The prophet tried to warn Saul. You had to follow God's commands. Some things you just have to do because God said so, and we might not always understand it or agree, but it's just what God wants. But soon it seemed like it didn't even matter to Saul. That all that mattered to Saul was Saul. And no one was going to take what he felt was rightfully his. And there was not going to be any sharing with anyone. Not with David, not even with God. So how could David have just stood by or hid away and let it happen? How could David let this great God go ignored by their king or forgotten by their people after all God had done? No, Saul had to go. Saul had turned from God. He'd forgotten God. And what was once a great king ended up just an empty shell. Samuel once told him how the mighty had fallen. So the new king rises from his throne and begins to pace, trying to think all this through, trying to understand in order to not make the same mistakes that Saul made. And as he paces, he's wondering how to keep God's blessing and how to lead this new nation into the ways that God wants him to lead. How does he make this new city truly a city of peace? And as David paces the floor late at night in that quiet room with the moonlight dimly shining in, thinking back on all that he knew about Saul and all that he'd heard about the old king, wondering where he'd gone wrong, David begins to notice a pattern. Saul didn't remember to keep God in the center of his life. It started in just small ways at first, not remembering a simple instruction, deviating slightly from the plan, and God began to slip from the center of Saul's heart and mind. And the further then God moved from the center of Saul's life, the less Saul remembered God. And even though Saul gained power and things looking in from the outside seemed to be going well, the less Saul remembered God, the worse things got for him, until the point where this once great king, who was so blessed by God, was so paranoid and haunted that he turned against those who loved him the most. And his hubris leads to a terrible civil war in his own destruction. Saul, who was once so blessed and God's anointed, had let God slip so far from the center of his life until he didn't remember God at all. I don't like to claim that there are necessarily universal struggles with faith, or that we all experience faith in God in the same way. But if we stay here and reflect with David on Saul's downfall, I think that what becomes so scary about Saul is how close that can hit to home. I can only really speak for myself, but the number one struggle I hear from people as a pastor as they talk to me about their faith is how hard it is sometimes to remember to keep God in the center of our lives. It's hard to keep God in the forefront of all that we do. Saul doesn't seem to be the exception, or rather Saul here seems to be the rule. And there's nothing more than that I'd like to do this morning than to stand up here and tell you that I have the answer on how to always keep God in the center of our lives, to always remember God in any given moment. But I don't have that answer, because the truth is that I struggle with that all the time too. But hopefully the difference then between us and Saul is that for us, there's always a turning back. For us, there's always a remembering. For us, there's this reminder that doesn't let God slip so far out of center that we don't remember God at all. It's easy to forget in God at any given moment. Someone cuts us off in traffic and our temper rises. We worry about our own security and safety. Our wants are sometimes more powerfully pressing to us than the needs of others. That joke is so terribly inappropriate, but it's also really, really funny. That person's Facebook post is so wrong that it needs someone to tell them just how stupid they are for posting it. The doctor says that our blood pressure is creeping dangerously high, but that second piece of cake is just going to taste so good. The list goes on, but God slips from the center of our thoughts, and we don't necessarily then remember God or remember what God wants for us. And the danger then is that when we begin to let God slip in the small moments, when we forget God in the small things, if we do it enough, we end up like Saul and eventually don't remember God at all. And so what do? And here's where I'm lucky. And I have a huge advantage over you. Because in my job, I am forced to remember God every day. Literally, every day I'm either in a church or talking to someone from a church or working on something for a church. There isn't a day I'm not in the Bible. There isn't a day where I don't pray. There isn't a day I'm not in study of God or doing something to try and strengthen my own faith or the faith of those around me. My job requires me to think of God literally every day. And those are all the answers that I give someone when they ask me how to keep God in the center of their life. Read the Bible daily. Pray to God daily. Get active in the life of a church and make connections with the people in that church. And reach out then to help other people daily. Practice discipline and discipleship, especially spiritual discipline. I do these things daily, and yet every night when I lay down and reflect on my day, if I'm honest with myself, I can find more than one place where God wasn't at the center of my thinking or what I was doing, and I forget to remember God. Saul's struggle is real. But the good news is that by God's grace, our lives are not about always being perfect in remembering God in every single moment. But our lives are about striving and struggling to keep God in the center of it at all times. And I don't know, maybe the best thing we can do in order to try and keep God in the center of our lives is to look back and see where God has been. That even though we might forget, God doesn't forget us, even in the moments where we forget God. And to know then that God is somehow with us now, and God will continue then to be with us in our future despite our forgetting, our faults and flaws, and by putting ourselves instead of God in the center of our lives. And then when God does slip from the center, we need to notice that. And we need to pull God back to where God needs to be. Like Saul, our faithfulness isn't always about being perfect. We can't do that. But unlike Saul, we need to see when we're slipping away from the center. We need to pull back to God. And we can't then let it slip away until we don't remember God at all. We need to be like David in this moment, reflecting, remembering, seeing where God has been in hopes then of holding on to God as we go where he takes us. And so the new king looks out the window over the city bearing his name, the city of David. And he makes a promise to himself and a promise to God to never let God slip from the center of his life or from the life of this kingdom. That they will remember God in all they do. That they'll remember that this is the God that has been with them through slavery and exile and wilderness, through the coming into the promised land, through the bloodshed and wars that have established this kingdom and building this city. And the city will not just be known then as the city of David, but as the holy city. Jerusalem, whose name means city of peace, will not just be the city of David, but it will be the city of God, because God will be at the center of it. Will we, too, remember to keep God in the center of our own lives? Will this new king be able to keep his promise? Will he avoid the mistakes of Saul and remember God? Will he be able to keep God's blessing and lead his people into a future with peace and prosperity, or will he let God slip from the center and end in personal ruin? Find out next time on The Bold and the Biblical.